Ahoy and welcome to the channel. Tonight we dive into the darkness of ancient Rome to see what happened in the shadows of the Eternal City after dark. Tonight's episode is narrated by Edward Fairchild. Sleep well.
What Rome Did After Dark. A sleep documentary by Captain Sleepy. Part 1. The Last Light. Sometime in the 1st century of the Common Era, in a city of perhaps 1 million people, the sun goes down over the Tiber. It does not set dramatically. Rome faces west, and the Janiculum Hill catches the last of the light first, its ridge going orange, then red, then the particular bruised purple that belongs to Mediterranean evenings in summer. Across the city, on the Palatine and the Capitoline and the Aventine and the Esquiline, the temples catch it too. Their marble columns briefly warm, briefly gold, and then abruptly grey as the sun drops below the hills and takes its light with it. This is the moment the city transforms. Not slowly, not gently. Rome in the 1st century had no street lighting of any kind. The concept that a city might illuminate its own roads at public expense for the benefit of all its citizens would not exist for another 1600 years. Paris became the first city in the world to systematically light its streets in 1667 under King Louis XIV, when lanterns on ropes were strung across the capital after sunset. Rome, the greatest city of the ancient world, the city of 1 million inhabitants and 1,000 temples, and the accumulated wealth of a conquered Mediterranean, went dark at nightfall with the same completeness as a village in the hills of Umbria. There were some exceptions. Certain villas had oil lamps hung outside their entrances as a mark of status and a practical courtesy, and the vigils carried torches on their rounds, but these were points of light in an ocean of darkness, not illumination in any meaningful civic sense. One moment, the Forum Romanum is legible, its columns and its monuments and its marble paving visible and familiar, the ancient stones worn smooth by centuries of footsteps, the Arch of Titus, the Temple of Saturn housing the state treasury in its podium, the Rostra, the great speaking platform from which Rome's orators had addressed the people for centuries, all of it visible, populated, purposeful. The next moment, within minutes of sunset, these same structures are fields of shapes in various shades of darkness, navigable only by those who know them well enough to move through them without their eyes. The poet Juvenal, writing in the late 1st and early 2nd century, left what amounts to a street-level account of what this darkness felt like to the ordinary Roman. He described the experience of walking through Rome after dark as one of continuous, low-grade terror. In his 3rd satire, he catalogued the hazards with the precision of a man who had navigated them personally and unwillingly on many occasions. Roof tiles fell from the upper stories of the apartment blocks, the tall, overcrowded insulae that housed most of the city's population, and their trajectory in the dark was impossible to predict. Chamber pots were emptied from upper windows without warning or ceremony, their contents arriving at street level without regard for whoever happened to be below. The alleys of the Sabura district, the densely packed neighborhood that ran northeast of the Forum, narrowed in places to barely 1.5 meters in width, their surfaces uneven with centuries of irregular repair, their darkness absolute. Juvenal's advice to anyone walking Rome's streets after dark was blunt: make your will before you go out, and be ready. He was not exaggerating for comic effect, or not only exaggerating. He was describing a real physical environment that had real consequences. And yet, the city did not sleep. This is what is so remarkable about Rome at night. Despite the darkness, despite the danger, despite every practical incentive to remain indoors behind a locked door with a lamp burning and a dog at the threshold, the city continued. It had no choice. The infrastructure of the greatest urban civilization the ancient world had yet produced did not shut down at sunset. It simply changed its character. What had been the work of the day became the work of the night, and a different set of Romans emerged from their apartments and their workshops and their hiding places to do it. This is their story. Part 2. The City That Could Not Keep Still. To understand the Roman night, it helps to understand a specific law. Julius Caesar, in 45 BCE, introduced a piece of legislation known as the Lex Julia Municipalis. It is known to us because fragments of it survive on a bronze tablet discovered in 1732 near the ancient city of Heraclea in southern Italy. 2 pieces of bronze inscribed on both sides, one face in Latin and one in Greek, now housed in the National Archaeological Museum in Naples. The tablet is a remarkable object. It is a direct physical survivor of Roman legislation from the age of Caesar, specific provisions of an actual Roman law legible to anyone who reads Latin, on bronze that has been sitting in the ground for 20 centuries. One of those provisions banned wheeled traffic from the streets of Rome during daylight hours. The reasoning was practical to the point of being obvious to anyone who has stood in a Roman street and imagined it full of ox carts. The city's population density was extraordinary. Rome contained roughly 1 million people in an area considerably smaller than the city of Paris today, and its street plan had developed organically over centuries without the guiding hand of any houseman or city planning commission. Streets were narrow, irregular, and permanently contested between pedestrians, vendors, street furniture, and the general accumulation of urban detritus that 1 million people produce. The addition of wheeled vehicles to this equation was, during daylight hours, simply untenable. Caesar's solution was to push all wheeled supply traffic to the night. From dusk until the 10th hour of the morning, roughly 2 hours after sunrise, the streets belonged to the carts. Exceptions were made for specific categories: triumphing generals, vestal virgins, priests in religious processions, and contractors working on public building projects commissioned by the state. But private commercial vehicles, the wagons that brought grain to the bakeries, timber to the construction sites, stone to the builders, goods to the warehouses, amphorae of wine and oil from the ports to the merchants, all of them were confined to the hours of darkness. Later, emperors refined and extended the law. Claudius applied similar restrictions to the municipalities of Italy. Marcus Aurelius extended them to every city of the empire, regardless of its own municipal statutes. Hadrian went further, limiting both the number of teams and the maximum loads of carts permitted to enter the city at all. An early attempt at managing not just the timing, but the volume of urban freight traffic. By the 2nd century CE, the nighttime traffic ban was a fundamental feature of life in every significant Roman city, and Rome itself had lived under it for well over 100 years. The practical consequence was that every night, without exception, Rome became a city of wheels. The vehicles themselves deserve a moment's attention because they were not small or quiet. The standard goods wagon, the plaustrum, was a heavy platform of boards on solid wheels of several centimeters in thickness. The wheels were not rubber and they were not sprung. They were iron-rimmed timber rolling directly on basalt cobblestones, and the sound they produced was not a whisper. The poet Martial, writing in the 1st century CE, with the compressed fury of a man who has been woken by the same sound for the 1000th time, described the noise as making sleep in central Rome essentially impossible. He compared the racket of an iron-rimmed wheel on a Roman street to the kind of percussion that only the deaf could sleep through. Martial is worth spending a moment with. He was a sharp-tongued Spanish-born poet who lived in Rome for 34 years, from around 64 CE to the end of the 1st century. And his epigrams constitute one of the most vivid accounts of urban life in the ancient world. He was not a man who suffered his circumstances quietly. He complained about his neighbors, about his clients, about the food, about the noise. He complained in multiple epigrams about the impossibility of sleeping in the city. The wagons woke him. The street hawkers woke him. The money changers, setting up their tables before dawn, woke him. The schoolmasters who began their lessons in open-fronted schools at the first light. Martial notes bitterly that these lessons were conducted at sufficient volume to wake anyone on the street or in the building above, woke him. The blacksmiths starting their forges before the sun was fully up woke him. The fullers who stamped cloth in great vats woke him. Reading Martial on the subject of Roman noise is to encounter a man who was functionally sleep-deprived for most of his adult life, and who dealt with this by writing extremely good poetry about it. What Martial found most unbearable was the wagons. Because the carts ran all night, every night, the streets of central Rome between dusk and dawn were filled with a continuous percussion of iron-rimmed wheels on stone paving, of oxen lowing as their drivers urged them through narrow passages, of drivers shouting at each other when two wagons met in a street barely wide enough for one, of the creak and groan of heavily loaded wooden vehicles navigating corners that had not been designed with their turning radius in mind. Drivers sometimes sent runners ahead, young slaves whose job was to reach the far end of a narrow street before the wagon entered it, hold up oncoming traffic, and ensure clear passage. When two drivers arrived at the same narrow street from opposite ends simultaneously, without runners, The result was a confrontation that resolved itself through a combination of negotiation, stubbornness, and occasionally violence in the middle of the night, in the dark, at sufficient volume to wake the entire neighborhood. The wealthy dealt with this in the obvious way. They moved to quieter locations, away from the main supply routes. The truly wealthy maintained country houses outside the city entirely. At Tibur, modern Tivoli, or at Baiae on the Bay of Naples, and retreated to them during the most oppressive months. Seneca, the philosopher and advisor to Nero, lived for a period above a public bathhouse, and his description of the sounds that rose through his floor, the grunts of weightlifters, the splash of swimmers, the crack of cupping glasses applied to backs, the depilation screams of customers having their body hair removed, is one of the great pieces of ancient comic complaint made funnier by the evident sincerity of Seneca's suffering. For the ordinary Roman, the tenant of a 2-room apartment in a 6-story insula in the Subura, paying his rent through a management chain that began with a slave manager and ended somewhere in the accounts of a senator who had never visited the building. There was no moving. The noise was simply the condition of urban life. You slept through it, or you didn't sleep, and in the morning, you went about your business. Part 3. The Vigils, Rome's Night Watch. In the year 6 CE, the Emperor Augustus established the Vigils. He had been trying to solve the problem of urban fire for years. An earlier attempt had involved 600 publicly owned slaves, organized by the aediles, the magistrates responsible for public buildings and markets, into a fire suppression force. This had proved inadequate. Fires in the densely packed wooden insular districts of the city could move faster than the response the slave brigade managed. In 7 BCE, serious fires had consumed significant portions of the city, exposing the inadequacy of the existing arrangements. Augustus had also considered, and ultimately rejected, the model proposed by the extraordinarily wealthy Marcus Licinius Crassus, perhaps the richest private individual in the history of the Republic, who had maintained his own private fire brigade and operated it on a commercial basis. When a building caught fire, Crassus would arrive with his team and negotiate a purchase price with the panicking owner before his men began to work. It was, by any measure, an efficient system for enriching Crassus. It was, by equally any measure, an entirely unsuitable model for the public safety of a city of 1 million people. The solution Augustus devised in 6 CE was funded by a 4% tax on the sale of slaves. The Roman state had by this point an enormous slave population whose regular transactions provided a substantial revenue stream, and it produced a force of approximately 7,000 men, organized into 7 cohorts of around 1,000 men each. Each cohort was further divided into 7 centuries of roughly 80 men, each century commanded by a centurion. The cohorts were commanded by tribunes. The entire organization was headed by the praefectus vigilum, the prefect of the night watch, an equestrian official who reported directly to the emperor. The vigils were not soldiers in the formal sense. They were not part of the legions or the Praetorian Guard, and Roman historians such as Tacitus regarded them with a degree of condescension as a consequence. But they were organized along military lines, equipped with military-style rank structures, and housed in military-style barracks. 7 main barracks served the 7 cohorts, distributed across the city. Each cohort also maintained a secondary station, the excubitorium, in the second of the 2 regions it was responsible for, so that a smaller detachment could be permanently present throughout the area without requiring the full cohort to travel long distances in an emergency. The excubitorium of the 7th cohort in the Trastevere district across the Tiber survives in part to this day, accessible to visitors who descend 8 meters below the modern street level to reach it. It was originally a private house, converted to Vigiles' use in the 2nd century CE. What remains includes a porticoed courtyard, a central hexagonal fountain basin, interconnected rooms, and a small imperial shrine, the Sacellum, built in the early 3rd century. On the walls of this building, archaeologists found 97 graffiti left by the Vigiles who were stationed there, dated to the years 215 to 245 CE. Most of the graffiti are routine: names, dates, brief messages. But one stands out with a directness that crosses 2,000 years without losing anything. It reads, "Lassum sum successorum date. I am tired. Send a replacement." The vigils were organized into specialized roles that reflected the complexity of their dual mission. The aquarii were responsible for the water supply during fires and were required to have detailed knowledge of every public fountain and cistern in their district. The Siphonarii operated the force pumps. The Sipho, a horse-drawn double-action pump partially submerged in a reservoir of water, capable of throwing water to a height of 20 to 30 meters under full pressure, operated by 5 or 6 men working in shifts. The Emitularii had a rescue function. Among their equipment were mattresses that they positioned on the ground below burning buildings to receive occupants who jumped from upper floors. The Sebaciarii carried the torches on night patrols. The Balnearii, in later periods, supervised public bathhouses that remained open through the night. And the Carcerarii were the jailers, responsible for those arrested during nocturnal operations. Each cohort also had 4 medici, physicians, attached to it, an institutional provision for the medical care of both vigiles and fire victims that was, by the standards of ancient emergency services, remarkably organized. They had their own chaplain, the Victimarius, who maintained the cult of the protective deities of the core: Vulcan, the god of fire, and Vesta, goddess of the hearth, as well as the imperial cult. Their fire suppression equipment beyond the Sipho pumps included fire buckets of rope sealed with pitch, called ame, sponges, spongiae, axes, dolabrai, picks, secures, ladders, scalae, grappling hooks, falses for pulling down burning structures, quilted blankets soaked in water or vinegar, centones for smothering flames, wicker mats, formiones, long poles, pertici, brooms, scopae, and vinegar, acetum, which was thrown on fires as a chemical retardant, an early and apparently effective firefighting substance that the vigiles used regularly. They also deployed ballistae, essentially military siege weapons, for demolishing buildings to create fire breaks when a fire was moving too fast for the pumps to contain it. Their motto was Ubi dolor, ibi vigiles. Where there is pain, there are the watchmen. Every night in every district, the vigiles walked their rounds. The Sebeciari, with their torches, created the only consistent public lighting Rome possessed. A patrol group, perhaps 15 or 20 men, moving in formation through the darkened streets, their torches casting circles of yellow light that retreated as they passed, was the most visible sign of institutional order in the Roman night. They looked for fires. They looked for the first signs of a fire developing. Smoke where no smoke should be. The smell of something burning in a neighborhood with no obvious source. They arrested people found in the streets under suspicious circumstances. Runaway slaves were a specific target. The vigils were authorized to detain any slave found on the streets at night without a satisfactory explanation of their presence and their business. The Praefectus Vigilum, the man at the top of this organization, occupied one of the stranger institutional positions in Roman public life. He was responsible for order on the night streets and exercised a kind of night court jurisdiction over the cases his men generated. Having spent the night overseeing patrols and responding to whatever the night produced, he was typically the magistrate who then adjudicated those cases in the morning court. The same man who had been awake managing the Roman night then presided over the legal consequences of it. Part 4. The Bakers of Rome. While the vigiles walked their rounds and the wagon drivers cursed each other through the narrow streets, another group of Romans was at work in the places that mattered most to the survival of the city. The bakers had been at work since midnight. Bread was the foundation of Roman life in a way that is difficult to overstate. The Roman state distributed free grain, and from the time of the Emperor Aurelian in the 3rd century, free baked bread, to a significant portion of the city's population. The dole, the annona, had been a feature of Roman political life since the Republic. By the imperial period, it supplied perhaps 150,000 to 200,000 people, the registered recipients, with a monthly allocation of grain that represented the core of their caloric sustenance. Bread was not a luxury or even simply a staple. For a large portion of the Roman urban poor, it was the primary food. Everything else was supplementary. The grinding of grain was the first step in a process that began deep in the night. Roman millstones were large lava stone devices, the upper stone rotating against the fixed lower stone, driven by blindfolded donkeys or mules walking continuous circles in the confined spaces of the bakery. The animals went blind relatively quickly from the combination of the darkness, the enclosed space, and the continuous circular motion. a detail that is mentioned in ancient sources with the matter-of-fact acceptance of an era in which the welfare of working animals was evaluated primarily in economic terms. A blind donkey could still work the mill. The circle was small enough that sight was not strictly necessary. Archaeological evidence from Pompeii illuminates the Roman bakery with unusual precision. At least 30 bakeries have been identified across the city, recognizable by their distinctive equipment: the large millstone pears, the wood-fired domed ovens with their characteristic form, the stone counters where bread was displayed and sold. The bakery near the Via dell'Abbondanza, one of the best preserved, had 4 millstones, 2 ovens, and a kneading basin for mixing the dough, a layout that tells you something about the scale of production this single bakery was capable of. And the distribution of these bakeries across the city at regular intervals throughout the residential districts suggests a conscious provision infrastructure. Bread should be obtainable without significant travel from anywhere in the city. The timeline of bread production worked backwards from the point of sale. A customer arriving at the bakery's counter at the first hour of the day, shortly after sunrise, expected bread that was fresh and warm. Baking the bread took roughly an hour in the domed oven, heated to temperature by the wood fires that the baker or his slaves maintained through the night. Before baking, the shaped loaves needed to prove to rest while the leavening did its work, which took several more hours, depending on temperature and the quality of the leaven. Before proving, the dough had to be mixed and kneaded, a physically demanding process that Roman bakers employed slaves to perform, the rhythmic labor of working large quantities of dough by hand being exactly the kind of sustained, repetitive, skilled physical work that Roman slave economics were organized around. And before mixing, the grain had to be ground. Work backwards from dawn through all these stages, and you arrive at a starting time around midnight. The millstones began turning. The fire in the oven was built up and maintained. The dough was mixed in the darkness and set to prove. By the time Rome was waking, the bakery had already been operating for 5 or 6 hours. The baker's establishment, his pista was the Latin term, meaning literally the one who pounds, occupied a specific social position in Roman urban life. He was a tradesman rather than a gentleman, but a tradesman of some substance. The state's interest in the bread supply meant that bakers were a regulated profession. Their guilds, the Collegia Pistorum, had legal standing. In times of shortage, the emperor's attention focused on the bakers and their work schedule, the permanent night shift, the oven that never fully cooled, the smell of baking bread that permeated the surrounding streets from midnight to dawn made them a specific kind of presence in the neighborhood that they occupied. That smell deserves particular attention because it operated across the darkness in a way that the bakery's daylight visual presence could not. The smell of bread baking in a wood-fired oven is warm and yeasty and complex, and it travels. In the cold and dark of a Roman winter night, with the insulae shuttered against the temperature and the streets largely empty, the bakery's oven scent would reach several blocks in still air. For anyone awake at that hour, the insomniac, the vigilist coming off patrol, the wagon driver resting his oxen at a public fountain, the smell announced the bakery's presence as clearly as a sign. Part 5. The Thermopolium, where Rome ate at night. The Romans, who were not baking bread in the small hours and not driving supply wagons through the streets, had, by this time, largely retired to whatever sleeping arrangement their circumstances provided, but not all of them. And for those who were awake, who had been awake, who were awake by choice or by the nature of their work or by the simple insomnia that dense urban living tends to produce, there was a specific Roman institution that kept its fires burning: the Thermopolium. The word comes from the Greek thermopolion, literally the place where hot things are sold. And the institution it describes was the Roman equivalent of what a later age would call a tavern, a chop house, a cafe, and a convenience store simultaneously. A thermopolium was a street-level food and drink establishment, typically built into the ground floor of an apartment block, its frontage open to the street, its counter of masonry and marble studded with the large ceramic containers, dolia, sunk into the stone surface and filled with food kept warm by the coals or hot water beneath. In Pompeii alone, approximately 80 thermopolia have been identified and mapped. The city is smaller than Rome was, and its population a fraction of the capital's, but the density of thermopolia, roughly 1 for every 500 or 600 residents, suggests the scale of the institution across the empire. If Rome replicated Pompeii's ratio, the capital had somewhere between 200 and 300 thermopolia serving its million inhabitants, distributed through its residential districts with the regularity of a supply network that understood where demand was located. The excavation of the Thermopolium of Regio 5 in Pompeii, completed in 2020 as part of the Great Pompeii Project, produced one of the most detailed pictures of a Roman food establishment ever recovered. The Thermopolium stood at the intersection of the Vicolo delle Nozze d'Argento and the Vicolo dei Balconi, a small square in front of it containing a cistern, a public fountain, and a water tower, a complete miniature infrastructure cluster of the kind that sustained neighborhood life. The counter held 8 dolia, ceramic jars embedded in the masonry surface. Laboratory analysis of the residues in these jars identified the actual food that had been stored in them at the moment Vesuvius ended the operation in August of 79 CE: duck bone, pig, goat, fish, land snails, ground fava beans at the bottom of a wine jar, used, as Roman culinary texts confirm, to clarify and alter the flavor of the wine. The frescoes painted on the counter's front face depicted mallard ducks, a rooster, a nereid riding a seahorse, images that functioned as advertising, as menu illustration, as what one archaeologist described as a kind of trademark for the establishment. One fresco showed a dog on a leash, the complete skeleton of a very small adult dog, perhaps 20 to 25 centimeters at the shoulder, suggesting deliberate selective breeding toward a miniature size unusual even by Roman standards, was found in the corner between the 2 doors of the Thermopolium. On the frame surrounding the painted dog, someone had scratched in the Roman equivalent of a pub toilet wall inscription, Nicia Sinaede Cacator, Nicias, shameless shitter. Probably, the excavators suggest, the work of a prankster or a disgruntled employee aimed at the establishment's owner, a freedman from Greece. The insult has outlasted the insulter, the insulted, the establishment, the city, and the civilization that produced all of them by 19 centuries and is still legible to anyone who reads Latin. These were not high-end establishments. Roman literary sources regard the Thermopolium with a mixture of snobbishness and fascination that almost certainly masks a degree of personal familiarity that the authors preferred not to acknowledge in writing. The food was simple: bread, lentils, chickpeas, olives, cheese, occasionally small portions of meat or fish, cheap wine diluted with water. A fish and pork dish appears to have been a standard offering at Regio 5, based on the bone analysis. Salty fish sauce, garum, the ubiquitous Roman condiment produced by fermenting fish with salt over months in large ceramic jars and used to season virtually everything, would have been present in some form at almost any Thermopolium counter. Small shrines in the Regio 5 Thermopolium were dedicated to the Lares, the household gods, to Mercury as the god of commerce, and to Bacchus as the god of wine. A functional pantheon for a food and drink business, pragmatically maintained. Behind the counter, remains of wooden racks suspended from the ceiling had once held amphorae stacked horizontally, their contents available to pour. The upper floor of the establishment appears to have included guest rooms, suggesting the Thermopolium also served as a modest inn. For the night workers of Rome, the vigils coming off a patrol, the wagon drivers whose route had brought them through this quarter, the baker's assistant who had been relieved for an hour, the insomniac tenant from the apartment above, the Thermopolium was the night's one reliable comfort. A lit counter in the darkness, something hot to eat, a cup of diluted wine, or posca, wine vinegared with water in the cheaper versions. The company, brief and transactional and nonetheless human, of other people in the same condition. The lamp oil that lit the Thermopolium's counter through the night came, like most of the lamp oil that lit the Roman world, from North Africa, from the olive groves of what is now Tunisia and eastern Libya, where Roman agricultural management had developed one of the most productive oil-producing landscapes in the ancient world. The grain in the bread had come from Sicily, or from the fields of the Nile Delta, the wine from Campania, or from the islands. Even in the most mundane details of a night at a Roman Thermopolium counter, a cup of wine, a piece of bread, the lamp burning overhead, the full geographic reach of the empire was present. Rome ate its empire every night. Part 6. The Insula. Life in a Roman apartment block. Most Romans slept in an insula. The word means island, and the insulae of Rome were, in a sense, islands, self-contained blocks of residential space rising from the city's streets, separated from neighboring buildings by the narrow lanes that ran between them. The 4th century regionary catalogues, Administrative records of Rome's 14 districts, compiled in the late imperial period, record approximately 44,000 to 46,000 insulae in the city, compared to roughly 1,790 private houses, the domus of the wealthy. The ratio tells you everything about who lived how. The domus was the architectural exception. The insula was the Roman norm. These buildings could rise to extraordinary heights. 9 or 10 stories were recorded in some cases before the building codes restrained them. Augustus, alarmed by the combination of structural collapse and fire risk that tall wooden-framed construction in dense urban conditions produced, capped new construction at 70 Roman feet, approximately 20 meters. Trajan later reduced this to 60 Roman feet, roughly 18 meters. Even at these constrained heights, a 6-story insula rising from a narrow Roman street created a canyon effect that reduced the sky visible from the street level to a strip and made the lower streets permanently shadowed. The social geography of the insula was vertical, and it ran opposite to the logic of a modern lift-equipped building. The desirable apartments were at the bottom. Ground floor and first floor tenants had better construction, thicker walls, lower fire risk, proximity to the water supply at street level. The city had no system for pressurizing water to upper floors. The aqueducts fed public fountains and the wealthy domus with piped water. But an insular resident above the ground floor fetched water from the street fountain and carried it up by hand, however many flights their apartment required. For a family on the 5th floor, the daily water supply represented a significant physical undertaking. As the floors went higher, the apartments shrank and cheapened. The rooms on the upper floors were often single spaces, serving simultaneously as bedroom, living area, and workroom. They had minimal ventilation. They were hotter in summer, heat rises, and a Roman summer in a top-floor Roman room with small windows and no cross-ventilation was a serious physical ordeal. And colder in winter, when the thin walls, often partly timber, offered inadequate insulation. They were further from the street-level latrines. Many upper-floor residents used chamber pots, which created the disposal problem that Juvenal complained about with such feeling. And they were at greatest risk in a fire, because fire in a timber-framed building begins to compromise the upper floors quickly. And the stairs, the only means of egress, were among the first things to go. Juvenal catalogued in one passage the possessions of a poor insular resident who had lost everything in a fire: a small bed, an old chest, 6 cups, a jug, and a small statue. This is the entire material inventory of a human life in a Roman upper-floor apartment, so sparse that it could be described and recognized as complete in a single sentence. Marcus Licinius Crassus, the triumvir, the richest man in Rome, the man whose personal wealth was estimated at some 200 million sesterces, owned a substantial portfolio of insulae in the city. His fire brigade scheme, by which he bought burning buildings from their desperate owners at heavily discounted prices before sending in his slaves to extinguish the fire, was arguably the most nakedly profit-motivated use of a civil emergency in ancient history. Cicero, who owned an eighth share of an insula on the Aventine and another in Puteoli, noted without apparent irony that when one of his tenement buildings began to collapse, he was actively discussing with his tenants how to extract more revenue from the situation. Life in a Roman insula was dense, noisy, and governed by a set of physical realities that shaped every aspect of domestic experience. The apartments had no kitchens. This was the fundamental fact of insular life and the fact that drove the thermopolium trade. The fire risk of cooking fires in multi-story wooden buildings was simply too high. Landlords banned braziers on upper floors, regulations widely ignored in winter since families needed heat. But the cooking of full meals was not something that happened in the upper apartments of an insula. You ate out, or you carried food home from the thermopolium, or you ate bread and olives and whatever required no preparation in your small room with its single oil lamp. That lamp deserves attention because it was the fundamental technology of the Roman night. Roman oil lamps were simple objects, a shallow dish or pinched vessel of terracotta or bronze filled with olive oil with a wick of twisted papyrus or plant fiber emerging from one end. The wick drew oil by capillary action and when lit, burned with a small, steady, slightly smoky flame that gave off a warm yellow light. Enough to read by if you held the lamp close to the page, enough to navigate a room without injury, barely enough to illuminate more than a small circle around itself. By the standards of modern illumination, this was almost nothing. The word lucubration, the act of working or writing by lamplight, with its connotation of late-night scholarly effort, comes directly from this Roman reality. Lucerna was the Latin for lamp. Lucubratio was what you did by its light. The younger Pliny, writing to a friend about the daily schedule of his uncle, the elder Pliny, the great naturalist and encyclopedist who would die on the beach at Stabiae watching Vesuvius erupt, described a man who regarded every moment not spent in reading or writing as wasted. Pliny the Elder got up before dawn to work by the lamp while the city was still quiet enough to think, had himself read to at meals and in the bath, and treated sleep as an inconvenient interruption to intellectual production rather than as a biological necessity. For the ordinary insular tenant, the lamp served a simpler purpose. It was on while he needed to see, and off when he could no longer afford the oil or when sleep seemed close. Olive oil cost money. The tenant who was careful with his money calculated his lamp oil the way he calculated everything else. The lamp went out when the lamp went out, and the room was dark, and the city's noise continued outside the window, and sleep came, or it didn't. The walls of the insular room, which were thin enough that neighbors' conversations were clearly audible, and thin enough that the winter cold penetrated them with minimal resistance, were typically plastered and painted in whatever the builder or landlord had seen fit to apply. In the better insulae, the lower floor apartments had painted decorations of some ambition, landscape frescoes, geometric patterns, mythological scenes rendered with varying degrees of skill. In the upper floors, the plaster was plain white if it was anything at all. The floor was tile or packed earth. The window, if there was one, was small, covered in winter with a wooden shutter or with the thin sheets of translucent mica that served as the Roman equivalent of glass. Actual blown glass, being expensive enough that it was reserved for the domus and the public bathhouses. In this room, in these conditions, the Roman tenants slept. Part 7. First Sleep and Second Sleep. Here is something about the Romans that modern people find surprising, and that turns out to have implications for how we understand our own relationship with the night. The Romans, like most pre-industrial people, did not expect to sleep in a single uninterrupted block of 8 hours. The concept of consolidated, unbroken sleep, the 8-hour-a-night norm that modern medicine recommends and modern insomniacs torment themselves for failing to achieve, is, historically speaking, a very recent invention. It emerged in the 19th century alongside the industrial reshaping of work schedules by the factory clock and the spread of artificial lighting that allowed and eventually required people to push their waking hours deep into the night. Before that, across many centuries and many cultures, a different pattern prevailed. The Romans called it the prima somnia and the secunda somnia, the first sleep and the second sleep. A Roman going to bed in the early evening, shortly after dark, since there was little practical reason to stay up past sunset without specific purpose or specific entertainment, would sleep for roughly 3 to 4 hours. Then he would wake. This waking was not a malfunction. It was not insomnia, not a disorder, not a sign that something had gone wrong with the body or the mind. It was simply the natural midpoint of the night's rest. The first sleep was complete. The second sleep had not yet begun. In between, Romans did things. They prayed. This was considered a particularly appropriate time for prayer, the quiet middle of the night when the soul was most receptive and the day's preoccupations had not yet reasserted themselves. They visited the latrine, since the interruption of deep sleep typically coincides with the body's management of its internal processes. They read if they had lamps and books and the eyesight to manage it. They talked with their spouses or companions in the particular intimacy that the middle of the night and the darkness and the brief wakefulness between sleeps permits. They thought, and Roman writers attach considerable value to this period of nocturnal contemplation, regarding it as a time when the mind, freed from the noise of the day, could engage with questions that the day's pressures did not permit. Seneca, the Stoic philosopher who considered the quality of thought as important as anything else in a well-lived life, recommended the middle of the night as a time for what he called the daily accounting of the soul, an examination of the day just past, its decisions and its failures and its small achievements, conducted in the quiet between the two sleeps when the mind was alert but the body at rest. He was not describing an unusual practice. He was recommending a practice that his readers would have recognized from their own experience, that they would have been doing already in their own way, in the particular wakefulness of the Roman middle of the night. The research that established this pattern in modern scientific terms came from the historian Roger Aekirch, whose book, At Day's Close, published in 2005, compiled an extraordinary range of historical references to segmented sleep from medieval European sources, legal documents, medical texts, prayer books, literary works, and established beyond reasonable doubt that biphasic sleep was the norm in pre-industrial Europe. Before Ekirch's work, this pattern had been invisible in plain sight, mentioned everywhere in the historical record, but never systematically studied. After reading Ekirch, a psychiatrist named Thomas Wehr ran an experiment. He took 14 healthy volunteers and restricted their light exposure to a single oil lamp for 14 hours each night, recreating pre-industrial lighting conditions for a month. Within a few weeks, the subjects' sleep patterns changed. They began sleeping in two distinct phases, separated by a period of 1 to 2 hours of quiet wakefulness. The wakefulness was described as peaceful, contemplative, relaxed, not anxious, not frustrated, simply awake, in the dark, between two sleeps. The subjects had not been told about biphasic sleep. They had not read Ekirch. Their bodies had simply reverted, when given the conditions that the body evolved in, to the pattern that those conditions produce. The Roman in his insular apartment who woke at the 3rd hour and lay in the darkness listening to the wagons in the street below was not an insomniac. He was a Roman, in the middle of the night, doing what Romans did, what perhaps all of us would do if we returned the night to the darkness it was designed to be navigated in. Part 8. The Suburra After Dark. If there was a district of Rome that never slept, never even genuinely attempted to sleep, it was the Suburra. The Suburra occupied a valley between the Esquiline and Viminal hills, running northeast from the Forum in a long depression that collected the noise and the commerce and the social complexity of the city in concentrations that even other crowded Roman neighborhoods found remarkable. It was the most densely populated district in a city of extraordinary population density. Its streets were among the narrowest. Its insulae were among the tallest. Its population was among the most economically mixed, in the way that economic mixing actually works in a city without zoning, which is that poverty and relative prosperity coexist at close range because proximity to commerce is valuable to everyone, regardless of their means. Julius Caesar was born in the Suburra, or very close to it, in 100 BCE. This is one of those biographical details that rewards sitting with for a moment. The man who would become Dictator Perpetuo, who would conquer Gaul and cross the Rubicon and reshape the Roman world with a force of will that the word extraordinary barely contains. He spent his childhood in the Suburra's narrow streets, absorbing its noise and its density and its social variety. Before the pontiffs and the Senate and the legions and the whole trajectory of Roman history took him somewhere else entirely, Caesar was a boy from the most chaotic neighborhood in Rome. The gambling dens were open after dark. Dice gambling, alea, was technically illegal in Rome, except during the Saturnalia festival in December, a legal restriction whose enforcement was approximately as effective as Roman law enforcement typically was on activities that a large portion of the population wished to pursue. The gambling establishments of the Subura operated at night because the night offered the cover and the relative absence of vigil's attention that the activity required, and because night was when the people who gambled had time to do it. The workers who were free after their day's labors, the night shift workers taking their rest between duties, the men who had nothing else to occupy them in the darkness of a Roman evening. The architecture of the gambling den in the Subura was typically that of the thermopolium it often was or was connected to, a counter of some kind, a back room, tables, dice, and the particular social atmosphere that dice gambling produces across all centuries and all cultures. Intense silence, punctuated by exclamation, the rotation of small amounts of money among the same participants in patterns that benefit no one conclusively, and the specific quality of hope that is the gambling establishment's fundamental product. The brothels were open. Prostitution in ancient Rome operated on a scale and with a legal frankness that the modern world does not replicate. Brothels, lupanaria, were registered, regulated, and taxed. The meretricium, the prostitute's tax, was a recognized revenue stream for the Roman state. In Pompeii, the lupanar near the Forum is one of the best preserved buildings from the ancient world, its painted panels advertising specific services above each room's doorway with a directness that requires no translation across 2 millennia. Its graffiti on the walls, recording the names and assessments of clients with a candor that is the commercial review system of the ancient world. A small bed of stone in each of its 5 ground floor rooms. Stone is durable. Wood is not. The Subura's night economy operated under the vigil's nominal authority. But the vigils were 7,000 men covering 14 regions of a city of 1 million people, and their attention on any given night was finite. The gambling dens and the brothels and the wine cellars and the street vendors and all the other institutions of the Roman night economy had, over centuries of coexistence with the vigils, developed a working arrangement that operated on the well-established urban principle that law enforcement of activities that many people want to pursue is most effective as a background constraint rather than a foreground prohibition. And woven through all of it, the food sellers. The street vendors who had been working since before dawn moved through the nighttime Subura with their portable equipment. The trays of bread, the pots of hot food carried on shoulder yokes, the skins of wine, supplying the gamblers and the nighttime workers and the insomniacs with the basic commercial transaction that cities depend on. Someone has something you need, and they will sell it to you, in the street, in the dark, at whatever hour you happen to need it. The philosopher Juvenal, who despised the Subura as only someone who knew it well could despise it, described the nighttime district in terms specific enough to feel almost photographic. The smell of the streets, the sound of singing drunks, the hazard of the chamber pots. He was describing his own city, his own night, the darkness in which he walked home from dinner parties with his cloak pulled tight and his eyes open. Part 9. The Wealthy Roman Knight. The wealthy Roman did not spend his night in the Subura. He spent it, ideally, in a domus, a private house of the kind that the upper classes maintained in Rome, with its atrium open to the sky, its tablinum where business was conducted, its triclinium for dining, its inner garden or peristyle courtyard, its cubicular ranged around the inner spaces, its walls painted with landscapes and mythological scenes of varying ambition and skill, its floors tiled in mosaic that ranged from geometric simplicity to the astonishing pictorial complexity of the Nile mosaic or the Alexander mosaic at Pompeii. At the Sena, the evening meal, which was the main social event of the Roman upper-class day, and typically began in mid-afternoon and extended well into the evening, a prosperous Roman would have entertained his clients and friends in a demonstration of wealth that was simultaneously hospitality and performance. The triclinium, the dining room, held 3 couches arranged around a central table, the diners reclining on their left sides in the Roman fashion, and the number of couches determined the social mathematics of the event. 9 diners was the ideal arrangement, since 3 couches of 3 was considered the optimal configuration for conversation that included everyone without losing the intimacy that a dinner table provides. The organization of the Sena had its own vocabulary of excess. The gustatio was the starter: eggs, olives, dormice, raw vegetables, shellfish, small portions of fish. The prima mensa was the main course, which in a household of any ambition could extend through multiple dishes. Roast meats, boiled meats, stuffed dishes, elaborate preparations that the Roman culinary tradition had developed over centuries of imperial access to the ingredients of 3 continents. The secunda mensa was the dessert course: fruits, pastries, honey-based confections, the particular Roman fondness for sweet things that operated across every social level. Petronius, writing in the 1st century CE, produced in the Satyricon a fictional dinner of such elaborately documented excess, the Cena Trimalchionis, Trimalchio's feast, that it reads simultaneously as satire and recipe book. Trimalchio, the freed slave made fabulously wealthy and hosting a dinner designed to impress people who cannot be impressed because they understand exactly what he is doing, serves a roast pig stuffed with sausages that burst free like intestines when the pig is carved, a dish in which the 12 signs of the zodiac appear in the appropriate food for each sign arranged in a circle, and a wine of such extravagant vintage that the assembled guests are moved to laugh and applaud. Every Roman reader would have recognized the type. Some of them had attended versions of this dinner. After the Sena, the guests departed. They would be escorted, if the host was generous and the neighborhood warranted it, by the host's slaves carrying torches, a practical necessity given the state of the streets and the darkness, and a social courtesy that communicated the value the host placed on his guests. The guests themselves, if they were wealthy enough, were carried home in a litter, a portable couch enclosed by curtains, carried on poles by 4 to 8 slaves, the ancient equivalent of a private vehicle with the advantages of keeping its occupant off the dangerous street, dry from the rain if it was raining, and insulated from any confrontation the night might otherwise have offered. The host, the dinner having concluded and the guests departed, retired to his cubiculum. The Roman bedroom was not necessarily a room of any particular aesthetic character. The cubiculum was simply a room, typically small, typically positioned away from the atrium to reduce noise exposure, sometimes windowless or with a small high window. It contained a bed and whatever personal objects the occupant valued. Wealthy Romans slept on beds with wooden frames, leather strap or rope suspension systems, and wool or feather mattresses. Augustus, who was by Roman standards rather abstemious in his personal habits, famously used the same small bedroom winter and summer, valuing it for its constancy and its quiet. The household slaves slept where they could. The ostiarius, the doorkeeper, slept at or near the front door by definition. He was the household's first barrier against the street, and the door was his post. The body slaves who would be needed first thing in the morning slept as close to their master's cubiculum as the house plan allowed. The dog, the Roman domus typically had one, the Mosaic warning cave canem, beware of the dog, being one of the most common decorative features of Pompeian domestic thresholds, lay where it chose, which was usually where it could most effectively monitor the household. In the great households of the Palatine Hill, where the senatorial families maintained their establishments and the emperors their palaces, the nighttime establishment was essentially a small village. Dozens of slaves, perhaps hundreds in the grandest cases, maintained the fabric of domestic life through the hours of darkness. Water was fetched, fires were managed, the evening's dishes were washed, the lamps were trimmed and replenished, the master's correspondence was organized, the morning's business was prepared, and somewhere in the center of all this quiet industry, behind a closed door, the wealthy Romans slept. Part 10. The Night Sky over Rome. Here is something that is easy to forget, and that changes everything about how we picture the Roman night. From every point in the ancient city, on a clear night, the stars were visible in their full number and their full brightness. Not as we see stars today from modern cities, where light pollution has reduced the Milky Way to a rumor and the brightest stars to a handful of points above the orange horizon glow. The stars over ancient Rome were the stars of a pre-industrial sky. The full canopy of them from horizon to horizon, brilliant and numerous and arranged in the patterns that the Romans, who were serious students of the night sky for both practical and philosophical reasons, could read with an ease that modern city dwellers have permanently lost. The Milky Way was vivid. The Romans called it the Via Lactea, the Milky Road, and they debated its nature in terms that reveal minds genuinely engaged with questions that empirical observation alone could not resolve. Was it the path of the sun, the scattered remains of a celestial catastrophe, the road that souls traveled after death toward the divine realm? Aristotle had proposed that it was a meteorological phenomenon, a kind of permanent weather feature of the upper atmosphere. Democritus had come closer to the truth. He believed it was composed of vast numbers of stars, too small and numerous to distinguish individually. The Stoic philosophers of the imperial period, who regarded the cosmos as a rationally organized whole and the night sky as its most direct expression, wrote about the stars with a reverence that makes sense once you understand the quality of sky they were observing. Seneca, in his Natural Questions, engaged with astronomical questions across multiple books, writing about individual stars with the attention to their particular characters, colors, relative brightnesses, seasonal appearances, relationships to other stars, that suggests a man who spent significant time under a clear sky watching them. He had the sky of a man for whom the Milky Way was not an occasional rural sight, but the permanent backdrop of clear nights from any rooftop in the city. The Romans navigated by the stars as a matter of practical literacy. The farmer oriented his agricultural calendar to the heliacal risings and settings of the Pleiades and Arcturus and Sirius. The sailor found his latitude from the pole star and his seasons from the positions of the major constellations. The city dweller who went out at night oriented himself by the sky in a way that modern urban navigation, GPS, streetlights, phone screens, has made entirely unnecessary and therefore entirely forgotten. The night sky was a functional landscape, not an aesthetic spectacle. The Roman calendar was lunar in its origins, and Romans remained attentive to the moon's phases in a way that modern urban people largely are not. The full moon over Rome was a specific and significant kind of event. It meant light in the streets, which meant safer streets, which meant more nocturnal movement was possible without the dangers that total darkness created. The new moon, conversely, meant absolute darkness, and Romans were as aware of this in their planning as modern people are aware of the weather forecast. You factored it in. Venus as the evening star was visible from late afternoon and through much of the night during the periods when its orbit brought it into the western sky. It was the brightest object in the night sky after the moon, and its light was sufficient to cast faint shadows on a clear night. Jupiter was frequently the second or third brightest object. Saturn, slower and further, moved through the zodiac at a pace the Romans tracked with astrological attention that was for them neither marginal nor eccentric. Astrology in Rome was a mainstream intellectual practice that had the serious engagement of serious people at every social level, from slaves who had the charts of their masters cast in the hope of understanding what lay ahead, to emperors who consulted astrologers on questions of state policy. The philosophical basis of Roman astrology, the Stoic belief in a rationally ordered cosmos in which celestial configurations reflected or determined terrestrial events, was not obviously inferior to any other available account of the relationship between the cosmic and the human. All of this, the navigational literacy of the stars, the astrological tracking of the planets, the simple human pleasure of lying on a warm roof in August and watching the Milky Way move through the sky, was available to any Roman willing to look up. The night sky was the one luxury that required neither money nor social standing. The slave sleeping beside the front door and the senator on his Palatine Hill were looking at the same sky. Part 11. The Hours of the Night. The Romans measured the night differently from how we measure it. Their system divided both the day and the night into 12 hours each, but the hours were not equal by our standards. They were equal by the daylight and darkness they contained. In summer, when the days were long and the nights short, daytime hours were longer than nighttime hours. In winter, the situation reversed. A summer daytime hour was roughly 75 of our minutes, a winter daytime hour roughly 45. This variable hour, the hora, was the standard unit of Roman time, and the sundials that stood in public spaces across the city told the time only during the day and only by the season's calibration. The great horologium of Augustus in the Campus Martius used an Egyptian obelisk, brought from Heliopolis and erected in Rome in 10 BCE, as its gnomon, casting a shadow across a vast grid of bronze inlaid in the travertine pavement below. On Augustus's birthday, the shadow of the obelisk pointed directly at the entrance of the Ara Pacis, the altar of peace, a coincidence that was either a remarkable achievement of astronomical planning or an even more remarkable coincidence, and that served simultaneously as a timepiece and as propaganda about the cosmic significance of the Augustan settlement. At night, time was marked by water clocks, the clepsydra, from the Greek, meaning water thief. The clepsydra measured the passage of time by the regulated flow of water from one vessel into another, the level in the receiving vessel indicating the hours elapsed. The vigils used water clocks to regulate their patrols. Presiding magistrates in the law courts used them to measure the time allotted to each speaker. A speaker could be silenced when his water ran out, a physical enforcement of time limits that the modern conference organizer can only envy. In wealthy households, the clepsydra was the slave's instrument, the means by which the household kept the schedule that the household required. For most Romans, however, the hours of the night were approximate things. People spoke of the first hour of the night, the fourth, the sixth, with the looseness that characterizes timekeeping in the absence of precise instruments. The position of the moon provided a rough indication. The quality of the darkness, its depth, the particular silence of the streets was another. Experienced urban dwellers developed a feel for the time from the sounds of the city, whose rhythms they knew as intimately as a musician knows the rhythm of